being where you are. So that's important. I also think this is important because what we have now in the United States is we have churches which are basically have assumed all the fundamental assumptions of the sexual revolution, but they're still trying to get a Christian ethic out of it, and it won't work. It's just not going to work. You can't get Christian practice out of these particular assumptions. So let's go back and take a look at the sexual revolution, and I hope this little sketch will be helpful. So the sexual revolution, which kind of most people date it to have begun in the 1960s, obviously dating a cultural movement is hard. It's like, saying the Renaissance, began on February the 2nd, 1425 at 12 a.m. or something like that. It's hard to do something like that. But whenever it really began, it's not difficult to locate its fundamental and overriding assumption, and it was this. The sexual revolution begins with the assumption that traditional sexual norms, which linked sex both to lifelong marriage and also to procreation, that was the kind of the traditional assumption. The sexual revolution assumed that that way of looking at things was out of date, irrational, and the big word, it was confining. That is, tying sex to lifelong marriage and tying sex to procreation was seen as something which belonged to a bygone era, and also it was understood to frustrate individual human happiness, right? The idea here being, right, that we become happy by doing what we want at any given moment, okay? That was the assumption. And that kind of led to a number of things, but one of the things that it certainly led to was it led to the idea that the fundamental norm governing all sexual behavior was really one thing, and that was pleasure. So by decoupling sex from lifelong marriage and decoupling sex from procreation, we get the idea that the fundamental purpose of sexuality is essentially pleasure. That's its fundamental purpose. And one of the huge consequences that comes from this is the beginnings of what would later come to be called, the term for it is casual sex. That was one of the direct consequences of the sexual revolution. The idea that sexual relations between people was fundamentally a matter of sort of pleasure, entertainment, that really didn't have much, if any, sort of moral consequence or weight to it. So the fundamental assumptions of the sexual revolution lead to what we now know today as sort of like casual sex. And that led to some things too. One of the things that it led to was it led to the idea that pregnancy, procreation, was a kind of a burden that needed to be avoided. Or that pregnancy was a sort of a disease that needed to be dealt with, right? And so one of the consequences of the sexual revolution and its assumptions about sexuality was not only the increase in casual sex, but also the immense increase in abortion. Abortion, the practice of abortion, is an essential part of the sexual revolution. And so whenever the Supreme Court is about to hear some sort of case related to abortion, you'll always hear the same thing said. That is, that abortion is fundamentally about freedom. That's how we've come to think of it. And that's a consequence of the sexual revolution. The other thing that was sort of difficult, the other difficulty kind of posed by the sexual revolution, is that in the final analysis, it doesn't really see sex as having any real fundamental meaning or moral significance at all. In this context, sex becomes a kind of recreation. And if you've been to a movie theater recently, or if you've watched advertisement, you'll see the consequences of all that. Another thing that happens as a consequence of the sexual revolution is the increasing phenomena of cohabitation outside of marriage. And as I noted on our first time together, it's really important that we understand that cohabitation before marriage is a serious problem within the church today. Christianity Today, a couple months ago, had an article about the issue. This is presented for like evangelical Protestant churches. Cohabitation is increasingly becoming the norm among Christians. And the results are not very good. One of the things that we see here is that the average length of cohabitation outside of marriage, the average length of that kind of relationship is about 3 years. And the other thing we notice is that actually couples that cohabit prior to marriage have a higher divorce rate than those who don't. That kind of is counterintuitive because the whole practice of cohabitation was accepted by a lot of people on the grounds that it was sort of like trial marriage. You could kind of like informally have a marriage to see whether it would work for you or not. And if it didn't work, well, then you could kind of walk away from it. What cohabitation seems to do, and this is, marriage counselor after marriage counselor has noticed this. What cohabitation actually seems to do is it kind of schools people in the avoidance of making long-term commitments. So it actually undermines marriage because it tells people, well, long-term commitments are kind of scary. You don't really want to walk into them, and so best to kind of push them off as long as possible. So what happens is that the sexual revolution adopts a series of metaphors to describe its approach to things. And this is sort of this is important rhetorically, right? How we talk about things is important because it also sets the context for how you might argue against something. So here's the language that's being used. The sexual revolution presented itself as being liberated, enlightened, progressive, open, allowing people to sort of fulfill and find their individuality. Whereas, so the language goes, the problem with the Christian sexual ethic is it's confining, it's limiting, it kind of stifles people's freedom. It's sort of backward and non-progressive. It's for the unenlightened, okay? So you can sort of see how rhetorically, right, this might work. So, I'm taking a survey to find out what your views of marriage are, and I come up to you and I've got my clipboard and pen and I say to you, excuse me, would you say that you're an enlightened, progressive, freedom-loving individual, or do you embrace repression, backwardness, and dogmatism? Okay, which one of those two things are you in favor of? Well, it doesn't take much thought to see where most folks are going to land on this. But I think the worst thing about the sexual revolution, in addition to all the other things, is this. The worst thing about it is it finally adopts a false understanding of human beings. That is, the sexual revolution, in effect, is premised on a false anthropology, a false understanding of human nature. And you could talk about that false anthropology in a number of ways. Let me talk about it this way. The sexual revolution assumes that it's possible for us to separate heart and body. The sexual revolution, in effect, says, right, it's possible to have multiple and ongoing sexual encounters without those encounters in any way, shape, or form having any mental or emotional effect on you whatsoever. Heart and body, the sexual revolution says, can be neatly separated. And that's a false understanding of human beings. God's created us in such a way that we aren't simply like hearts or minds that are stuck in bodies, but rather we are ensouled bodies. Our bodies give expression to our souls. What happens to our bodies affects our souls. The development of our souls affects our bodies. The two things cannot be separated. But the sexual revolution actually not only said that they could, but that they also should. It's possible to have, multiple ongoing sexual encounters without those encounters in any way, shape, or form affecting your heart or your mind. And the empirical evidence about that shows, I think, that assumption is completely false. So the sexual revolution adopted a false, and I would even go further and say, it not only adopted a false understanding of human nature, it adopted a dehumanizing understanding of human nature. And it's led to all kinds of things, things that we tend not to want to talk about. That is, I think you could say, without exaggeration, that the phenomena that we know today where, in effect, pornography has become mainstream, that is, pornography in this country is a larger industry than Hollywood. Pornography in this country is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. The phenomena of sex trafficking is also another outgrowth of this, right? It's possible to think of people simply as physical objects and to treat them as such. That's the kind of fundamental premise that it's work here, and it's a dehumanizing premise that we want to be very, very critical of and aware of. So God designed us for our bodies and our souls, our hearts and minds, our emotions, to function together and not be separated. And that's the fundamental part of the Christian assumption. So what we have to do, I think, is we have to kind of go back now at this point in the sexual revolution, and we have to do some really deep thinking to kind of rethink human sexuality. We've been trying to do this over the last couple Sundays. So let me kind of summarize kind of where we've been on this, but also to maybe move us forward a little bit. There's a wonderful book called Society and Sanity, written by a guy by the name of Frank Sheed. Frank Sheed was both a lay theologian and a publisher. He founded the publishing firm of Sheed and Ward in England, which still exists today. And Sheed founded his publication for the express purpose of publishing Christian books in England. So he wrote this really important book called Society and Sanity. And this book is was first published in like the 1940s, early 50s. I want to read to you a quotation from the book because I think it still speaks to us today in a really fundamental way. So here's the quote. Quote, "The typical modern man practically never thinks about sex. He dreams of it, of course, by day and by night. He craves it, he pictures it, is stimulated or depressed by it, drools over it." Sort of interesting word, right? Drools over it. "But this frothing, steaming activity is not thinking. Drooling is not thinking, picturing is not thinking, craving is not thinking, dreaming is not thinking. Thinking means bringing the power of the mind to bear. Thinking about sex means striving to see sex in its innermost reality and the function it means to serve. To use the power of sex successfully, we must use it in balance with the rest of our powers for the service of the whole personality within a social order with eternity to come. All this is too complex a matter to be left to instinct or chance, to desire or mood, or the heat of blood, or the line of least resistance. It calls for hard thinking." This is exactly what the sexual revolution refused to do. Basically what it did is it said you do not need to think about the phenomena of sex. It's enough to have the instinct and follow it. So what she's saying is, one of the things that marks us as human beings is our capacity to think, right? One of the things that separates us from the 2-year-old having a tantrum is our ability to sort of assess what's going on in our mind right now and say, you know what? While I would dearly love to throw this music stand at Stan Maddock, sorry, Stan, it probably wouldn't be an appropriate thing to do in this context. Okay. That is, the idea here is that sex is one of the powers that we have as human beings, and one of the things that marks us as human beings is our ability to reflect and think about those powers and to ask ourselves, what is this thing for? And how should it be best employed? So that's what Sheet is, I think, getting us to try to think about. So she goes on to say something I think that's also important. She says, the thing that we have to realize about human beings is that we're complex creatures. On one hand, we have a biological element to us by virtue of the fact that we have bodies. But on the other hand, there's also an emotional component to us, and there's also an intellectual component to us. And God's design or God's goal for us is for those three things to be in alignment, right? God's goal for us is for the physical, the emotional, and the intellectual to all be in alignment and not out of kilter with one another. And this means, so Sheed says, that any understanding of sex which simply reduces it to the biological, which simply thinks of sex as an instinct or something that's needed to engage in reproduction, something which sees sex reduces it to the biological is going to be inhuman and inadequate because it's going to leave out the emotional part and leave out the mental part. So all those things have to be put in. So with that question in mind, let's ask ourselves the question, well, why are we sexual creatures? Right? We are sexual creatures, and the question would be, well, why are we sexual creatures? What is our sexuality for? What's its purpose? Now, one of the things that distinguishes us as human beings is we can ask ourselves that question. Okay? Other animals, even other higher mammals like dogs, as far as we know, don't sit around all day and asking themselves now, what is sexuality for, right? What are we supposed to be doing with it? We have that capacity. We can reflect and think. So let's see if we can answer that question in some way. Now, I think that what we can do is we can answer the question, what is our sexuality for, by looking at our design. How were we designed by God? And historically speaking, Christianity has offered basically a kind of twofold answer to this question. What is sexuality for? And the two parts of that twofold answer are these. First, clearly, right, one of the things that sex is clearly for is procreation. That's clearly one of its purposes, right? It requires a man and a woman to be involved in the process of procreation, each of which contributes something unique to that process. And therefore, the Christian idea, right, or the Christian understanding of marriage as fundamentally being between a man and a woman is not like irrational bigotry. It does have a sort of like rational foundation to it, okay? And it's in the way that we were designed. So one of the things that is true about human sexuality is one of its purposes is procreation. Now, I'm using this word procreation deliberately. I think it's inadequate to simply talk about reproduction for this reason. It's important to use the word procreation because as Christians, right, we believe that one of the things that happens in the context of marriage when we have children is we are cooperating with God to create new life. That is, in effect, right, when we engage in the process in marriage, right, of bringing new human life into the world, we are sharing in God's creative capacity. And therefore, right, that is a noble calling, okay? To share in the creative capacity of the Creator, capital C, is a noble calling, okay? And we need to recognize it as such. So we refer to it as procreation, sharing with God in his creative capacity. So that's one purpose. The second purpose of human sexuality is, in traditional Christian theology, is what has been called union, the joining together of husband and wife in the bond of marriage. Now, why is that important? Well, I think it's this. That is, the thing that happens, or one of the things that happens in marriage, right, is marriage is an act of self-giving. So you can think about this on a number of levels. Think about it this way, right? So let's pretend that we're at a wedding here at St. Peter's, and we've got a couple standing up there before the altar, right? And they're going to do something really important. They're going to face one another, and they're going to vow their faithfulness to one another. So Fred, do you take Angela here to have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, and forsaking all others, be faithful to her so long as you shall live? I do. It might be said with a bit of nervousness, I do, or it might be said, I do. Either way, it's still fine. But the idea right here is, notice what Fred's just done. Fred has given his whole self over to Angela here, to have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and health, till I die. So notice what Fred's doing. Fred's promising that he's going to keep the promise that he just made to Angela until he can no longer keep it because he's dead. Okay? We used to have I was once served in a diocese with a bishop who, there would be like these periodic clergy meetings, and, people would come up with all sorts of lame excuses to avoid them, for good reason, because most of them are pretty dull. So the bishop would say, now you only have one excuse for not being at this meeting, and that reason is a funeral, your own. That was the only reason how you could get out of the meeting. So notice here what's going on is that in this act of marriage, we have two people who give themselves completely to one another. And the idea now here is that their sexual relationship is a sign of that self-giving. Very important. That is, and here's what I tell couples that are going through our premarital process, marriage is sort of a unique sacrament. This is true for Anglicans, for Roman Catholics, and also for the Orthodox. Marriage is a unique sacrament in the sense that, strictly speaking, no priest ever marries anyone. The couple marry one another by exchanging the covenant promises of marriage. So the covenant relationship here between husband and wife mirrors the covenant relationship between God and Israel in the Old Testament, and between Christ and the church in the New Covenant. Okay? And therefore, their union, their coming together, is a sign of that bond. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons, but let me hold up just one. That bond is essential because, as we all know, right, human beings aren't fully formed at birth. Okay? Some don't seem to be fully formed at 35. But it takes a long time for human infants, right, to grow into humanity As I say, sometimes it takes a while. We call that process humanization, okay? And because that's the case, the fundamental place where that humanization is going to occur, the most important place where that's going to occur, obviously is going to be in the family. And therefore, right, a lifelong, enduring marriage is essential to the humanization of the children that are produced by that marriage. Okay, so all this kind of fits together, I think, in some important ways. Now, a couple things about what needs to happen. And here I'm drawing on a book called The Meaning of Sex by the philosopher. His name is J. Budziszewski. He teaches law and philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. And Budziszewski says that in the context of the family, 3 fundamental things need to occur for every child. These aren't the only things that need to occur, but there are 3 fundamental things that really need to happen for children as they grow up. Thing number 1, coming to an understanding of your own particular sex. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? That's something fundamental that happens in the context of growing up in a family. So that's thing number 1. Thing number 2 is also important, an understanding of the opposite sex, right? I come to an understanding of what it means to be a man, but I also need to learn who women are, and I also need to understand the proper way in which they're to be treated. And therefore, right, one of the most important things that children can see is mother and father having a proper relationship with one another so they can see what it's supposed to look like, okay? This is how men are supposed to act. This is how men are supposed to treat women. This is how women are supposed to eat. This is how women are to treat their husbands. Children get a sense of how all this works by seeing it. And then thing number 3, an understanding of the proper relationship between the two. The understanding of how the sexes relate to one another. So it's important, therefore, to see, right, that this idea of the connection between lifelong marriage, sex, and family actually is completely rational. It's not like arbitrary. And I think the other thing we want to say about it, and here I'm going to have to finish real quickly. I think the other thing we want to say about it is that it also provides a foundation for happiness. Let me read to you a quotation. Budziszewski cites, I'm trying to dodge the sun here. I'm not avoiding the light because my deeds are evil. I'm just trying to get out of the sunshine. So I don't want to create the wrong impression. So Budziszewski cites a book by 2 sociologists. The book is called Growing Up with a Single Parent, What Hurts, What Helps. And it's by Sarah McClanahan and Gary Sandifer, who are kind of run-of-the-mill secular sociologists writing about single parenting. And here's a quote that Budziszewski pulls from the book that I think is really interesting. Quote, "If we were asked to design a system for making sure children's basic needs were met, we would probably come up with something quite similar to the 2-parent ideal." That is, if we were asked, what would be the thing that would probably most guarantee the good welfare of children? If we were asked that, we would say that the 2-parent ideal would be that thing. That is, growing up in a household, a stable household with 2 parents is sort of like the best sort of foundation that children can receive for having a happy and also a successful life. Okay, I can't finish without saying a word about sexual purity because everyone's going to want to say, okay, you know what, he said he was going to talk about sexual purity and then never said a word about it. So we can't have that happen. So just a quick word about sexual purity, and then I'm going to literally run. So here it is. You know, I think that it's a sign, right, that we that we live in a culture in which even talking about sexual purity in church is sort of seen as kind of like odd, right? So I think what we need to say is just simply this. Sexual purity really isn't all that complicated or all that difficult in a way. So let me just summarize it by saying this. And once again, this is sort of traditional, so I'm not inventing anything new. For Christians, sexual purity looks like this. If you're married, sexual purity involves complete faithfulness to your spouse. That's what sexual purity means for you if you're married, right? It means that you are intent on keeping the marriage vow that you made to your spouse when you got married. That's what sexual purity will mean for you. Now, does that mean that that won't involve struggle or difficulty? Not at all. It will involve struggle, and it will involve difficulty, but you know what? It's worth it. It's worth it, okay? Sexual purity for another kind of person, if you're single and you're a Christian, sexual purity for you involves celibacy. Will that involve a struggle? Will that be difficult? Absolutely it will. Will it be worth it? Yes. Because what we're saying is this, and I think that one of the things, I could talk about this like for half an hour, but lucky for you, I can't, literally. I think one of the things that we've kind of lost sight of is the meaning of celibacy. We tend to think of celibacy today as simply, celibate people are people who don't have sex, and we think of it as negative. But once again, that's not in keeping with traditional Christian thought. Remember, historically and traditionally, celibacy played an important role in the church. It reminded us of something very, very important. People who took vows of celibacy reminded us that as Christians, we are looking for a fulfillment and a happiness which sex cannot give. Celibate people stand as a reminder, right, that even though sex is a gift from God, we are expecting a happiness and a fulfillment that is actually beyond that.